think one part of my introduction was missed, unfortunately. I am basically a police officer in Pakistan, belong to Police Service of Pakistan, with 12 years of experience in Pakistan at different parts, northern part of the Pakistan. I served about 5 years. My last assignment was in National Highways and Motorway Police. That was mixed. So I usually start my talk with a quote which I like too much. Once, a friend of Albert Einstein asked him, Einstein, can you tell me which is infinite in this world? He replied, yes, there are two infinite things in this world. The one is the universe, and other is human stupidity. When we recast the human conduct in the human history, I'm a little bit convinced that we are living in a very stupid world. Unfortunately, we talk about the human rights, we talk about the convention, we talk about the systems, but if we look at the human history, in 5,000 years of the human history, we come across 14,000 wars, the small, bigger war. For my understanding, there are two basic human behavior, the influences that dominated the human beings in 5,000, even more than that. One is the misdirected religious orientations. It will look at the 100 Years of War. It will look at the wars. The basic reason was the misdirected religious orientations. And the second influence that was quite dominant was the chauvinistic nationalism. The many wars, look at the colonization, look at the freedom movements. So this is a second prominent human influence. And the third, dehumanizing factor, I call it dehumanization, is the dehumanizing factor in this present world, that is terrorism. Everybody talks about terrorism. We want to look for the single definition of terrorism. In 2004, 1,700 books were written on terrorism. About 98% books talk about what is terrorism and what is not terrorism. 35 books in 1 week. Can you imagine the volume of the literature? But I understand that terrorism is a medley, it's a mixture of both influences that got affected in our political reflections, and that is the mix of both the misdirected religious orientation and chauvinistic nationalism. Terrorism exists in how many countries? 87 countries of the world. It's not particularly about one country. You can't brand a country a terrorist country. You can't brand a community a terrorist community. It exists in many countries of the world. But the active terrorism means the terrorism that involves human killing, that exists in 65 countries of the world. But amazingly, 82% of its victims exist in 5 countries. Look at those 5 countries: Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, Syria. It's 66% of the victims of terrorism exist only in 3 countries. That is Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. If we look into the last 1 decade or more than that, from 2000 to 2013, we come across 48,000 incidents of terrorism, acts of terrorism all over the world. And that took the lives of more than 100,000 people. The data is challengeable. For my understanding, is a lot of the human killings have not been recorded worldwide. For example, I can give you an example. In Iraq, more than 100,000 people have been killed. In Pakistan, more than 55,000 people have been killed. But it's a 5-fold increase in the acts of terrorism from 2000 to 2013. But if we look at the patterns, from 2000 to 2007, there's a quite increase in the acts of terrorism. And the 2007 was the peak year globally. insofar as the last decade or so is concerned. But from 2007 onwards up till 2011, there is a decrease in the acts of terrorism. And from 2011 onward, there is again increase in the acts of terrorism globally. In 2013, we came across about more than 17,000 acts of terrorism worldwide. If we look at 2012, it's about 11,000, more than 11,000, so there is 61% increase in the acts of terrorism worldwide. Terrorism stands for fear. The many acts of the terrorism doesn't have human casualties. The globally or the worldwide is about 2.2% people have been killed by a single act of terrorism. If we look at the data, the compare, everybody's fearful. Everybody's scary because of terrorism. But empirically, if we correlate this data, the human killings in terrorism with the homicide killing is 40 times more as compared to the killing in terrorism. It was alarming for me, in the United States, about 14,000 people have been killed in homicide every year. In Pakistan, from where, with 196 million population, about 14,000 people have been killed. About 30,000 people killed in traffic accidents. But here, the terrorism is more a topic that is having emotive punch, is more scary because the terrorists want to communicate, is a way of communication for the reversal of government policy or other targets. Why I am into this topic, in fact, it's not a topic just for my research, it's not a topic just for my degrees. In fact, it was 2009. I was posted in a city in the north part of the country, the Kohat, and on the first day I arrived at city at 4 o'clock, and my seniors, the district police officers, called me for dinner, and we were on the dinner table. I started with the first bite and heard a big explosion. We put everything, just came out of the house, and then rushed to the place. It was a suicide attack. It was an attack in a mosque. I saw human bodies, the blood found, the human pieces, and 24 people were killed. And after some time, my police cop, my junior, he was coming to me with a head in his hand. He said, "Yes, sir, we recovered the head of the suicidal bomber." That was not sufficient for me. And after some time, I noticed a lady screaming at the crime scene. She was crying. I didn't know the Pashto because I'm from Punjab, and I asked my cops just to inquire what she's saying. He said that he lost her husband, and the husband, before going to the mosque, asked the kid, "Just go to the mosque. Why you don't come to the mosque for the prayer?" And the both boys followed the father, and the 2-year-old daughter, they crawled and followed them. When they reached the mosque, this bomb blast happened. And that was the moment I felt something inside me that something has stopped. It was a question, in fact, to me as a law enforcement officer. Was my role? What I can do for these people? And that evening, I decided to work for the victims of terrorism. That's my story, in fact. My passion is just beyond my degrees. I don't care what sort of the degrees I am doing. The reason is that, we have to work for the human beings whatsoever, from wherever. I don't care. And then I attended few conferences internationally. The first was the United Nations Far East Institute. That was about the victimology. I heard this word victimology for the first time. How many people in this room just know about the victimology? Can you raise your hand? The victimology is a specialized subject within criminology that talks about the victim's rights, the participation of the victims in the criminal justice system, the system of information for the victims, the medical wellness of the victims, the financial compensation for the victims. It is an interdisciplinary subject that deals with the causation, the process of victimization and the consequences of victimization. It started around 1950s, and the Mendelsohn, John Mendelsohn, is called the father of victimology. We have here 22,000 forums of the association in the United States working for the victims of crime. Can you imagine? There is a survey and 22,000 forums, but few are working for the victims of sexual crime, victims of homicide, more than 5 or 6 forums for the victims of terrorism in the United States just after the 9/11. It's a big subject. But the victimology talk about the victims of crime. It doesn't too much talk about the victims of terrorism. I coined the term terror victimity. When this subject started, it was called the science of victimity. Generally, globally, at the United Nations level, the victims of terrorism are considered the victims of crime. We don't have a separate statutes that deal with the victims of terrorism. If we look at the data in 2013, you see 35% of the victims of terrorism globally exist in Iraq, and about 17% they belong to Afghanistan, and 11.2% of the victims of terrorism globally exist in Pakistan. And these are the 10 countries. And India, it's rest of the world is 10%. And we have India is the 5th number, Philippines, Yemen, Thailand. In Pakistan, I have taken this data from different sources because there is no consolidated data compiled at the government level. About 20,000 civilian people have been killed in last from 2001 to 2014. I belong to law enforcement officials, more than 5,800. When we joined police service, we were 22. Now we are 19. 3 of my batchmates have been killed in terrorism. And the last one was in Gilgit-Baltistan. He was a senior superintendent of police. The law enforcement is a major target. But you see, if we look in Afghanistan, the major target is law enforcement as compared to the civilian even. But in Pakistan, the civilians are the major target of the terrorists. And 4,000 army officers have been killed in this war on terror. It's Pakistan Army. 28,000 militants have been killed by the law enforcement over this period from 2001 to 2014. 72,000 injured. This is not statistics. There is a human life behind every number. But we don't realize this is the victim of the recent terrorist attack in Pakistan, the Peshawar incidents in which 133 kills, the children have been killed. It's not statistics, it's not number. There is a human life, there is a human suffering, there is human emotion behind every number. You can see how the victims of terrorism suffer.
Lives that were put out. Loves that were extinguished. separated. Eid al-Adha is a religious festival Muslims celebrate with great fervor. Dressed in their finest clothes, young and old, rich and poor, all flock to mosques for special mass prayers to thank Allah for His bounties. There is a smile on every face. With hearts full of joy, they lovingly embrace each other and exchange greetings. This small, peaceful village was turned into an abattoir of human beings on the auspicious day when a suicide attacker blew himself up amid the mosque congregation. What was a moment before a tranquil, mirthful gathering became a gruesome spectacle of human corpses, limbs, blood, and cries of the dying and injured. Can one rationalize such barbaric massacre? Or human mind conjure up any religious justification for this savagery? Islam ordains that killing of one innocent person is like killing the whole humanity. What do the terrorists want? Ask young Kashif, where has his father gone?
Dead in blast.
It was sheer hell. There was no one to put my dead son onto a cot. We women lifted his body ourselves and carried it home on a cot.
What sort of jihad is this? Thousands of people have died because of it. This cannot be jihad. How did such people come to Pakistan? We are all...
Terrorism in the country everywhere has financial consequences. As per the official statement of the United States government, the US government has spent $4.4 trillion on the war on terror. $4.4 trillion. The independent sources tell that it's about $6 trillion the United States government has spent on the war on terror. The Pakistan's government claimed about $1 or $3 billion. You know, on the one side, we're losing human beings, the most precious thing. And on the other side, we have damage to the infrastructure. We have recently the issue of IDPs. As per the sources, is 1.5 million internally displaced people in Pakistan because of this war on terror, and 0.5 million in last 6 months because of the recent military operation in the country against the terrorists. The key word here, my dear friends, for my understanding, I am into this subject for 3 years. I have practical experience. I interrogated terrorists. We arrested, we killed them. The key word here is politics. You know, it's Taliban's, Pakistan Army, the US drones, and the civilian. But this little girl doesn't know what the politics is. She doesn't know what the American policy in Pakistan is. She doesn't know what the Pakistan Army wants. She doesn't know what the TTP demands. She says that, uncle, don't hurt me. I don't know about politics. She is the sufferer. The key word is the politics. Who are the terrorists? I'm not here to talk about what is who are the terrorist group. But a little bit, I want to show how they developed. In fact, it was the Afghan war. Before that, Pakistan was quite a peaceful country. So it was the political manipulation. They recruit Mujahideen or the Talibans, and these became the friends turned into foes. They were the friends of the United States, the friends of Pakistan government. Before 9/11, 3 countries officially acknowledged Taliban's government in Afghanistan. And after 9/11, everything reversed. You listen what the Hillary Clinton is saying.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen, and let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam.
These are the terrorists in Pakistan. The product is obvious. If you pamper the non-state elements for the political objectives, and after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, these people have nothing to do. And they thought that we are betrayed. The terrorists think that we are betrayed by the Pakistan's government, by the United States. And that's the reason they are attacking the army, they are attacking law enforcement. So after 9/11, everything happened, the war and terror started. There are 4 stakeholders: Pakistan Army, Taliban, the US, and the civilians. If we look into in a victimological perspective, we find few categories of the victim. The direct victim, if I got injured, or the direct victim is a person who got killed, is called direct. Indirect, if my family is my indirect victim in this incident. We use the term secondary victimization. If the state institutions are not providing adequate services, we become victim. We call it the secondary victimization at the hand of state institutions after an act of crime or terrorism. And the research proved that the secondary victimization is more traumatic for the victims as compared to the initial victimization. We have civilian victims of terrorism. There are certain disadvantages group within civilians, that is the women, children, elderly victims, and the victims in law enforcement, army officers. The few categories that have not been yet declared victim in any statute or the law, I will discuss later on. These are the civilian victims of anti-terrorism operation and the civilian victims of drone strikes. We conducted a survey involving 230 the victims from different parts of the country, and we took interviews from the direct and the indirect, male and the female, elderly people, and we find that 85% of the victims are the male youth, 80% are Sunnis, 68% married, and the average dependents in the victim family is 5.8. Mostly they are having urban origin, 74% about, and the average income, because they are from the poor strata. Most of the victims, they belong to poor families, and the average income we calculated is about less than $200 a month for the family, just not for one individual. So what is the feedback of the victim is concerned? You see, most of the victims, more than 85% of the victims said that their financial needs have not been met by the state institutions. And the second most pressing need is the medical need and the protection need. But they have psychological issues, trauma, but they don't understand about it. They couldn't explain their psychological conditions. So in different provinces, the situation is quite different. But you see, majorly, they have financial needs more. then followed by the medical needs, and third is their protection needs. They have community needs as well, but the patterns differ. Family, we identified the 5 major sources of victim services. Victim services doesn't mean only compensation. Victim services, I talked to you, the victim services start with just after an act, evacuation, right? And the health provision, emergency dealing, handling of the victims. Information is key in the victim services. If the victims don't know, if the indirect victims, I don't know my brother is alive or dead. I don't know where my brother is there. And the same happened in 9/11, you know. The many families of the 9/11 victims got the physical evidence of their dear one after many years even. And but the family members are the main source of the victim services, followed by the government. But if we look at the international bodies and the NGOs, it's a very low role played by the non-government organizations. There are different feedback of the victims in different states. But you see, in the Sindh, the victims belonging to Sindh, we conducted some interview of the Karachi blast. It's about 20%, you know, they think that the government has provided us protection or financial compensation. And the grading of the international organization, the NGO, is quite low. The family and the government are the 2 main sources. We calculated all the services and the feedback of the victims to have a one numerical value of their feedback so far as the government, international, non-profit, community, and the family. You see, the situation is the KPK is quite satisfactory. It's not very good, but the situation in Sindh is quite depressing. You see, it's about 28% only, and the 35% is in Islamabad. If we look at the participation level, you see, is the police 73% of the victims participated in or interacted with the police. But it is decreased when the investigation phase is there, on the prosecution and the judicial phase. But the judicial phase is very important for the participation of the victim, because the participation is very important for the victim services. But if I lose my brother or my son, and then nobody is going to ask me, I'm not the part of investigation, I'm not the part of prosecution. The court doesn't ask me to come to give my evidence. I don't know my terrorist is being arrested or killed. So I have a big disconnect with the state and society. That affects my trust in the state and society. And you see, police, but I have different perspective on the police help. Police help doesn't mean to just pack your body and just send to the hospital. Police help stands for protection. Although, because most of the victims, they are not quite educated, but they are more satisfied by the police help. But you see, the FATA, we don't have a system. The policing system is no policing system is FATA. For the victims suffer more in those areas where we have a weak governance system, and that is a big theory in the history of terrorism. You will see that the countries with the ghost areas have more terrorism. The ghost areas are the areas where there is a weak, the system of governance is very weak. And the FATA is a place where Al-Qaeda was established. And most of the colleagues know what the Al-Qaeda is. It's called chapter, it's called booklet. And when Osama bin Laden or Abdullah Azam went there in Peshawar, it was initially a rest house there where they collected. So this terminology quite. But the main source of their funding, their help, their networking started from the tribal areas. Because you don't have a police there, you don't have a judicial system there. But if you don't want to reconstruct the area, you can't eliminate terrorism from those areas. This is about the participation But in the Gilgit-Baltistan, I found that the lot of the victims have interaction with the judicial, the participation. Can anybody identify the reason why there is more participation of the victims? Anybody from Pakistan?
The Smiley.
Sorry?
The Smiley organization.
Ismaili, they are not too much involved in terrorism.
No.
They believe in non-violence, and because the nature of terrorism in Gilgit-Baltistan is sectarian. When we have a sectarian terrorism, the Shias and the Sunnis are killing each other, and then they contest for the cases that the other people or the offender from the other party should be behind the bar or convicted. That is the reason they follow their cases. But insofar as the normal civilians are concerned, if they lose their dear one, they don't care even. If the government or the government state institutions don't follow them, they don't care. So the same is the case with the protection. And the overall, despite the fact that they are not properly taken care of by the states, non-governmental, but in some areas they have quite high level of trust. That was amazing fact for me, because I went to all victims, almost 99% said, it is Allah, it is because of the God, we are the victim. They don't consider that is solely the government. They said, it is our fate to be the victim. So it was quite surprising, because religion in most of the society, and particularly in Pakistan, is the greatest healing force. It is the only healing force in the absence of formal systems. Then we have a comparison of the law enforcement and the civilian victims. You see, the law enforcement have less financial needs, because you see, if we look at the compensation formula, is about 30,000 bucks or the dollar are given to a victim family if the victim belongs to law enforcement, whereas the $10,000 are given to the victim, but it varies from state to state, because we don't have a system or the law at the federal level. The Balochistan government passed a specific law on the victims' terrorism. So, but insofar as the service is concerned, the more the victims of law enforcement have provided more services by the state institutions, so was the compensation. And amazingly, and their feedback about the family support is also more as compared to the civilian victims. So we have young, male, uneducated, urban, poor, disadvantaged group. This is about we have mass victimization cases. For example, the Shia Hazara community in Balochistan, repeatedly they are victim of terrorism. Repeatedly. So the trauma is transcending from generation to generation. Law enforcement, army, who are the unknown victims? These are the victims of mistaken retribution. These are the victims of anti-terrorism operation. This is one of the victims we interviewed. He said that on the 25th January 2014, the vehicle of Pakistan Army was attacked with a remote control bomb by unknown people, and my father was running a hotel, and they thought that some people are involved from this hotel. They came there and they lined up everybody and killed everybody. He said, my father was killed by Pakistan Army. Who is going to give me justice? So this is a category of the victim that is unknown to anybody. They are not given compensation. They are not provided any protection. This is Laiba, is a small girl. She lives in Peshawar. She went with her uncle, and their vehicle was passing through army convoy. The army man considers the suicidal bomber, or maybe they try to stop it, but they couldn't see the signal, and they started firing at the vehicle. And she lost her leg. And her father was given compensation, and he refused the compensation, and later on he was put behind the bars, and after 1 day he was released. And another category of the victims that is unknown, or that is not recognized as the civilian victims of drone strike. Two types of the strikes: the personality strikes, nature strike. more damage in signature strike, because it is not the planned. Sometimes the instant decision is taken by the CIA agent, or there are technical reasons as well. It's called soda straw effect, because you zoom in, you forget what else is there. And there are a few instances. And it started in 2004 in Pakistan, the first strike, 82 people killed in a religious school in Bajor, 18 people, laborers killed. There is no accurate data available. In fact, the Stanford University said it is 1 into 10. You kill one terrorist, 10 civilians. And there is Center of Civilians in Conflict. They also have published a report with the names of the civilian victims. And the New American Foundation is they say it's about 307 from 2004. And the Long War Journal, they say is about 361 drones, militants, 160 civilian. And the US president in one interview said it's about 40 civilian people have been killed in the US strikes in last 10 years. The Amnesty International report, the report is titled Will I Be Next? Is about the killing of the civilian by the US strike. And the Human Rights Watch between drone and Al-Qaeda. This is a victim, Manama baby. She was a school teacher. She was the US drone strike. But this is an area where we have to do a lot of research. The reason is no researcher can go there. Who will find the victims? Who are the victims? And who will provide them services? There are a lot of issues with the security. There are a lot of issues with the identification of the victims. And the fear factor is the very decisive factor. Nobody is going to be to tell any researcher. So abuse of power is a fourth unknown category of the victims. Well, there is a famous Adiala 11th case, and these are the suspects kept in Adiala jail. And when the court took the notice, the intelligence agencies took these people, and the 4 were killed later on. And there are more than 1,000 missing person cases. These are the suspects. But we will believe that until and unless there is evidence against terrorists, he can't be held responsible, or he can't be killed. There are few cases of extrajudicial killing. The same in case of the United States, is a violation of Geneva Convention. It all culminated into one phenomenon, you can say, is a lack of public support for the war on terror, and is about the losing the heart and mind. The challenge is at the broad level. We don't have a single definition of the victims of terrorism. The definition of the victims do exist in the UN Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice of the Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power. But the definitional crisis of the victims is the same as the definitional crisis of the terrorism exists. And are they macro victim? Is it theoretical debate? Are they different victims? Do they have more needs as compared to the victims of crime? Should we treat it as a separate categories of the victims? There's a lot of controversy. The answer lies in victimology. And I coined as a terror victimology, terror victimity as a subspecialized field within the victimology to address the needs, to look into the process, to look into the consequences of the victims of terrorism and how the state and society can evolve the system. And we have specific challenges with the evacuation and the recovery after the act of terrorism, medical treatment, trauma. We don't have a system of formal psychological counseling and information, social acknowledgement, compensation, trust, and there are critical issues with the emergency management. In case of the United States, after 9/11, they devised NIMS and the Incidents Command System or the National Incident Management System. Although there are a lot of criticism about the system, but there should be some system. There should be some SOPs. There should be some standardized protocol by the law enforcement how to lift the injured people. And the perspective, we don't have a separate law for the victims of terrorism except the Balochistan government passed it last year. And there is a few issues with the training of service providers. Lack of resources, I don't believe in lack of resources. If there is a bill, it is a question of priority. You spend $4.4 trillion, you spend $103 billion, but you don't have money for the victims. And the 43 nations in the NATO forces, they are spending a lot of money, and they are there for more than 1 decade, but the terrorism is there. But now let's talk about healing terrorism if you don't want to prevent terrorism. If you can't prevent the terrorism, why we can't talk about the healing terrorism? Segregate some money, establish victims fund for the victims of terrorism, you know. It's not the lack of resources, neither by the US government nor by the Pakistan's government. Now, why we need a separate victim? You can look how the victims are handled.
People have been reported dead, many more seriously injured. The blast happened inside a mosque near Shupal's home at his residential compound. The compound is located in a village around 40 kilometers from Peshawar, the capital of Pakistan's northwest frontier province.
This is the way that the victims are handled, you know, in the absence of the emergency protocols. And, you know, we required a perspective change. I'm running short of the time. And, you know, international response, you see, the 14 UN instruments talking on terrorism since 1963. There is no distinction. The UN Declaration is the fundamental principles that defines victimology, the victims' laws, the rights, and the Handbook on the Justice of Victims of the Use of Application. This is a very good document if you want to study this more, how we can implement this, the declaration, and then there is a UN guideline for the policymakers for the implementation. Global Counterterrorism Strategy 2006, the Article 8, Pillar 1, talks about the terrorism victim. The UN Secretary General, he conducted a symposium, international symposium on the victim of terrorism in 2008, in which the victims all over the world, they were asked to share their stories. And then we have a very good document at the UN, is the UN Office on the Drugs and Crime, the Criminal Justice Response to Support Victims of Acts of Terrorism, this in 2011-14. Last year, the United Nations started with the Victims of Terrorism portal. It's a quite nice portal, but they have all the resources available on the victims of terrorism. But a lot of the countries, even the portal doesn't talk about the Afghanistan, doesn't talk about Pakistan, Iraq, where the 82% of the victims exist. It's to talk about some European countries, you know. And then we have Ben Emerson's report. He recommended that terrorism is simply a human rights violation, and we have to take care. We need a global system, a global response to cater for the needs of terrorism and internationally. He even recommended, the United Nations recommended to have the Victims of Terrorism Fund at the international level. So, UN guidelines, you know, provide soft law basis, no effective interventions at the international law. And if we look at the Europe, 96% of the terrorism exists in only Spain and France, in 2 countries. And there is a lot of things, other initiatives at the European Union level. The Madrid Declarations 2004 is a very important. They conducted the first International Congress on the Victims of Crime. And the European Counterterrorism Strategy, March 11, is celebrated as the European Day of Remembrance. And there is a project called Terrorism De-Radicalization Terrorism, and they involve victims of terrorism to share their story. In some cases, they ask the convicted terrorists to say sorry to the public. So the Europe is an area where the regional responses are there. Insofar as the US concerned, the Victims of Crime Act 1984 started, and in 96 we have specific Victims of Terrorism Compensation Act, the Office of the Victims of Crime, the works, the director that keeps the separate amount. Then the Anti-Terrorism Emergency Reserve Fund is there. Section 624 US Patriot Act empower the director to make supplementary grants to the states. So after 9/11, 9/11 compensation fund was created. Kenneth was the special master for that, and 7,000 claims, including 4,400 of the physically injured. They were dealt with this, and the average amount of compensation to the 9/11 victim was 1.8 million, because there was no separate formula for the compensation. They took the age and the profession of that person, and there are 5 categories from 250,000 to 7.1 million. The average is 1.8. There are a lot of scholarship. Insofar as India is concerned, there is a central scheme. India started in 2008. The initial amount was 3 lakh. Now they increased to 5 lakh. And only 751 victims from 2009. But it is a nice thing in the South Asian perspective that India started with a separate system for compensating the victims of terrorism. But there are a few issues with the international victims. In Afghanistan, we don't have a comprehensive system. The Code 99 Fund deals with the victims of terrorism, but it is managed by the President's office. And the amount of compensation, there are a few instances that the US Army and the 5 countries even paid for the damages of the battle damages, but the amount is just $2,000. We need a policy framework, the victim-centered approach is required. I drafted a national policy for the victims of terrorism in Pakistan that initially consists of 50 points. What sort of the system we need, in fact? What sort of the response? There should be some centralized body in the shape of National Center for the Victims of Crime, or we need the Victims of Terrorism Fund. We need a survey to be conducted to assess what the specific needs at the national level the victim should have, so that we can amend or redraft the policy, separate laws with the standardization of procedure and compensation. We call the Victims' Bill of Rights. I identified even 22 basic rights of the victims after an act of the terrorism in view of their needs. So the Minnesota, for example, each states have their different title, but they have the victims, the Bill of Rights in the statutes. Training of first responders is required, especially to deal with the emergency situations, and witness protection scheme, because most of the victim is not a witness. This is different. It's much more than a witness. The criminal justice system takes as a witness only. There is need of victim forums in network. And in case of the United States, for example, there are 9/11 victims' families, Tuesday's children. There are 5-6 prominent networks, but the networks was established by the victims themselves, and they played a very good role. Victim impact statement is a statement in the judicial proceeding. It is a statement written by the victims to tell the court about the victimization. So there are a few recommendations I initiated with the forum to introduce this subject in the country, and I will wind up here. Let's join hands together, raise the voice of victims, speak to terror. Now I invite you for the question and answer. Thank you very much.